Part-Time UFO is an unassuming little game that is surprisingly fun, taking one core idea and executing it perfectly in a variety of different ways with a ton of character to boot. The exact same thing can be said of the game's soundtrack, which takes one musical theme and spins it out into a variety of arrangements to match each of the game's charming locales. And I don't mean that the melodic structure is kind of the same, or that there's a common figure that shows up here and there throughout the soundtrack. I'm talking the same notes, in the same order, in the same key, with the same chord progression underneath, with very few small exceptions. It almost seems like the soundtrack was a challenge for the composer, Shogo Sakai, to see how many different pieces of music he could make out of just one theme, and it's impressive to see the amount of music he draws out under these restrictions. Revisiting the same material over and over again draws your attention to what is different about each piece, and the changing elements of instrumentation, rhythm, and phrasing are inevitably what evoke the qualities of the specific location to which each theme is assigned. By taking these apart, let's try and figure out what tools of musical scene setting we have at our disposal besides the obvious techniques of melody and harmony that I usually focus on. The game doesn't have a basic main theme that we can use to compare to the various level themes, but if it did, it would probably sound a lot like the farm theme, the level that first introduces you to the game. The basic melodic structure is centered around the simple embellishment of a single note, like so. This figure starts on the 5th of the key, then quickly walks down to repeat the same embellishment on the root of the key G. We walk up to get a slight variation on the same embellishment of our 3rd, B, which then walks down chromatically to land on the 2nd of the key A. This sets up a perfect question and answer melodic structure, where the unresolved 2nd of the key leaves us wanting more, and the following repetition of the melody changes the ending to resolve to the tonic G. The melody basically tells you exactly how to harmonize it, and the harmony obliges with the simple 1-4-1-5 progression. The theme as a whole is incredibly simple, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean that it sounds almost timeless. With minor tweaks, it kind of sounds like it could have been written any time in the last 300 years. The melody and harmony happen to fit especially well with the bluegrass genre, which is used by the game's farm-level theme to evoke a rustic aesthetic. The melody is played by a fiddle, the banjo accompaniment arpeggiates through the chord progression, and the bass and drums give us a classic 2-feel underneath. But rather than a double bass sound, like you would expect from the genre, the bass is played in a low synth, and quick synth arpeggios flurry up and down over the end of each phrase. It's kind of strange, but pairing conventional stylistic elements from bluegrass music with these synth parts fits perfectly with the image of a quaint rural setting visited by flying spaceships. Now the form of this, and every other level theme pretty much, is that the melody plays through once, and then we get an equally long alternate melody over top of the same chord progression. The alternate melody is always something unique to the level. In this case, it's this little whistled figure, but every time it's capped off with this cute harmonized Vocaloid take on the last phrase of the main melody, singing the game's Japanese title. Altogether, this piece is light, simple, goofy, and undeniably charming. The game's museum-level theme, one of my personal favorites on the soundtrack, retains the charm while going in a totally different direction. The upbeat bluegrass 2-feel is replaced with a slow 12/8 feel, with the chiptune synth melody strolling along on top of the sparse piano part. There is so much more space in this version of the melody than in the farm theme, not to mention the piano accompaniment. The single chord per bar that the piano plunks out adds extensions onto the original harmony in closed voicings to get these really nice semitone rubs between the major 7th and the root of both the 1 and 4 chords. It somehow sounds so much more important than just a basic triad. I also love this G over C chord, a beautiful variation on a C major 9 sound. It adds so much color to what is still fundamentally a very simple 1-4-1-5 progression. The alternate section of the following 8 bars shows off once again quick rising arpeggios in the synth and the addition of these soft string pads before the harmonized Vocaloid line softly brings the loop to a close. In my headcanon, the rising quick arpeggios that show up in so many of these themes is supposed to represent the quick upward movement of the UFOs themselves, and the voices at the end are the 2 UFOs singing together while they work. All of these elements work together to create this air of quiet introspection, perfect for the museum setting, although any quiet introspection you may be tempted to feel will likely be shattered when this dinosaur skull comes crashing to the ground for the 19th time. The restaurant theme returns to a straight duple meter, and is much more similar and obviously recognizable to the farm theme that we started off with. But the tiny differences in rhythmic approach between the 2 themes makes a huge difference. The biggest difference, of course, is that the conventions of the bluegrass genre are replaced with that of a bossa nova to match the fancy restaurant setting. The rhythm guitar and drums lay out a variation on a samba clave pattern, while the bass and kick drum lay down the classic bossa nova bass pattern. Simple half-note piano chords are laid over top, laying the groundwork for the chiptune synth melody. Now this melody loses the rhythmic approach notes from the middle of each of the farm theme's phrases, and the result is that we lose the bounce and drive that the farm theme's melody had. Here, see what I mean. We also get rid of the chromatic walk down to the 2nd of the key and forgo the goofy quality that these kinds of chromatic approaches can often have. Altogether, this gives the restaurant's melody a much cooler vibe, almost like it cares less about what you think of it, which, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense for an upscale restaurant. Although, an upscale restaurant where you can get a 10-foot tall stack of pancakes. Huh. Also of note is the reharmonization of the theme, which uses very basic substitutions to the original 1-4-1-5 framework. A 3-6-2-5 replaces the final 1-5 move, and the move from 1 to 4 is extended out with an additional 6-2 move, the relative minor of the 1 to 4 that came before it. All of this just serves to increase the harmonic rhythm to 2 chords per bar, which also gives this arrangement a bit of a unique identity among its peers on the soundtrack. In all of these themes, I think that the genre conventions and instruments are meant to represent the scene of their respective level, while the addition of this synth to the arrangement represents the UFO's unusual presence in these terrestrial locales. The final area of the game, the moon, sees the UFOs returning to their home turf, and appropriately, this level theme is composed entirely with chiptune synth sounds. In fact, I'd say the genre conventions that this theme borrows from are that of the Mega Man battle theme. Again, we're in a straight 4/4 time, but the rhythmic feel here is a driving 16th note subdivision as introduced right at the beginning by this bass ostinato. The constant stream of 16th notes brings tons of rhythmic energy, augmented by the syncopated accents that run up a G blues scale. We are for once out of the key of G major and into the parallel key of G minor. perfect for the game's epic finale. The melodic structure is still the same, with only a few minor differences to make it fit more smoothly into the minor key. The melody, now tightly harmonized in thirds, still starts with a little melodic embellishment of the fifth, and then walks down to embellish other tonic chord tones the same way before moving chromatically down to land on a 5-chord chord tone to create that question and answer effect. The biggest difference here is the rhythm. The melody now rhythmically anticipates the third beat of each bar, which generates a ton of forward momentum. If you've already watched my last video on basic rhythmic analysis, you'll already know that. Listen to how hokey it would sound if you kept the basic rhythmic idea from the other versions of the theme instead of anticipating this beat. It's such a slight difference, and it sounds so much less cool. The alternating section this time is a badass synth solo over top of these added arpeggios in the accompaniment that lead to some really cool rhythmic clashes between the two voices. Overall, this isn't a particularly complicated arrangement, but Time UFO is not a particularly complicated game, and the tone of this tune, in the context of the rest of the soundtrack, sounds like a big step up in intensity. A perfect way to score the final battle against this evil alien robot without messing with the tone of the game as a whole. Now, I'm a big fan of smaller games like Time UFO that just take one core idea and see how far they can go with it, and the soundtrack is a really cool example of taking this exact same approach to the game's music. The soundtrack doesn't take itself too seriously, and it's not trying to be more than it is. It's just a bunch of charming little tunes that perfectly fit the game they were written for, both aesthetically and philosophically. Big thanks to patron The Brawl Girl for requesting this topic. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon here, or consider picking up a notebook at the Musician's Notebook. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.